Cassie of South Carolina, 1853. Christmas Eve, the night when Christian families gathered to celebrate the birth of their Savior, but in the grand dining room of the Whitmore Plantation, it became the last supper for a family who never saw their executioner coming. Cassie, that was her name, the woman who turned fine crystal into silent death, cook, enslaved, architect of the most patient murder ever recorded in the American South. They had taken everything from her, sold her 3 children at auction, whipped her husband to death for looking at Mrs. Whitmore wrong, branded her face with the letter R for runaway when she tried to find her babies. For 7 years after losing everything she loved, she ground their finest wine glasses into powder so fine it looked like flour, so sharp it sliced through intestines like razors, so calculated that each grain was measured to perfection. Every morning, she baked their bread with the memory of her children's screams. Every evening, she seasoned their meat with the grief of her husband's blood. Every meal, she added a pinch of glittering death that sparkled like sugar in the candlelight. For 847 days, Cassie fed them their own destruction, one microscopic shard at a time, until Christmas Eve 1853, when the youngest Whitmore child coughed up blood into his eggnog, and the family's screams echoed through halls built on stolen lives. This is the story of Cassie of Charleston, documented in coroner reports, court testimonies, and medical journals sealed for 170 years. Welcome to Echoes of Truth, where only the bravest souls dare to uncover history's darkest secrets. Do you have the courage to hear what really happened in the shadows of America's most brutal plantations? This isn't just another story about slavery. This is about a mother's vengeance so methodical, so patient, it makes modern serial killers look impulsive. Subscribe now and comment your location to join this investigation, because what you're about to discover will challenge everything you thought you knew about survival, justice, and the deadly art of revenge. Picture South Carolina in 1853, the air thick with humidity and the scent of magnolia blossoms that couldn't mask the stench of human suffering. The Whitmore Plantation stretched across 3,000 acres of the richest soil in Charleston County, where cotton grew as white as the master's teeth when he smiled at his profits. You could hear the crack of whips echoing across the fields at dawn, the singing of enslaved voices trying to drown out their pain by evening. The grand house sat like a monument to stolen wealth, its white columns gleaming in the southern sun while cast-iron shackles rusted in the basement below. Now, you have to understand, this wasn't just any plantation. This was where Charleston's elite gathered for dinner parties, where senators and judges broke bread, where the most civilized families of the South came to celebrate their prosperity. The dining room windows offered views of endless cotton fields, worked by hands that would never taste the luxury being served on bone china above their heads, Spanish moss draped from ancient oaks like funeral shrouds, and if you listened carefully on quiet nights, you could hear the whispers of those who had died in these fields, their stories buried beneath layers of Southern gentility and biblical justification. Master Charles Whitmore was what polite society called a gentleman planter, a man who could quote scripture with one breath and order a flogging with the next. His wife Eleanor hosted tea parties where Charleston's finest ladies discussed charity work, while human beings were bought and sold in the courtyard outside their parlor windows. To their neighbors, the Whitmores represented everything noble about Southern culture: gracious hosts, devoted Christians, loving parents to their 3 golden-haired children who played with carved wooden horses while real people lived in conditions worse than livestock. Charles had inherited the plantation from his father, along with what he called a natural understanding of the Negro disposition. He believed himself a benevolent master, often boasting to visitors that his slaves were practically family, a family he owned, whipped, bred, and sold at auction when times got tough. Eleanor took pride in her household management, particularly her kitchen operations, often telling guests how she'd civilized her cook, Cassie, turning a wild field hand into a culinary artist worthy of serving Charleston's most distinguished palates. The Whitmore children, Margaret, age 12, Thomas, age 10, and little Sarah, age 7, had never known a world where black people weren't their property, where their every comfort wasn't built on suffering they couldn't even see. The official story was simple. Cassie was a success story of Christian redemption and proper training. Master Whitmore would tell anyone who'd listen how he'd rescued her from the fields when she was just 16, recognizing her natural aptitude for domestic service. Eleanor would beam with pride, explaining to her lady friends how she'd personally taught Cassie to read recipes, to understand the delicate art of seasoning, to present meals that would impress even the most discerning Charleston palates. "She's like a daughter to me," Eleanor would say, her hand resting on her real daughter's shoulder as Cassie served their tea with downcast eyes and steady hands. The neighbors saw a model plantation where enslaved people were treated like family, where Christian values guided every interaction, where the natural order of society functioned exactly as God intended. Visiting ministers praised the Whitmores for their Christian stewardship, noting how well-fed and properly dressed their slaves appeared, how respectfully they behaved, how smoothly the household operations flowed. Local newspapers occasionally featured glowing profiles of plantation hospitality, describing elaborate dinner parties where guests raved about the exceptional cuisine prepared by the Whitmore family's treasured cook. What outsiders saw was a woman who had found her calling, who took obvious pride in her work, who seemed grateful for the opportunity to serve such a fine Christian family. They saw smiles, curtsies, and perfectly prepared meals, never suspecting they were witnessing the most elaborate murder plot in American history. But beneath this veneer of Southern hospitality lay a system designed to break human spirits and extract maximum profit from human flesh. The Whitmore plantation operated on what Charles called efficient management principles, a network of overseers, drivers, and informants that kept 300 enslaved people under constant surveillance. The slave quarters were deliberately built within earshot of the main house, so every conversation, every whisper, every cry of pain could be monitored and reported. A complex system of punishments and rewards kept people divided, turning potential allies into reluctant enemies who might betray each other for an extra ration of food or a warmer blanket. The kitchen, where Cassie worked, was positioned strategically between the main house and the quarters, a bridge between two worlds where she could observe both the master's lives and the slaves' suffering. Charles had installed a speaking tube system that allowed him to give orders directly to the kitchen without leaving his study, ensuring that even his wife's conversations were monitored and controlled. The plantation's isolation worked in their favor. Located 20 miles from Charleston proper, surrounded by swampland and patrolled by armed guards, escape was nearly impossible. Even the local sheriff was Charles's cousin, ensuring that any runaways would be returned promptly and punished publicly as an example to others. This wasn't just a farm, it was a carefully designed prison where every brick, every fence post, every carefully planned sightline served to reinforce the message that resistance was futile, that survival depended on absolute submission. When neighbors occasionally noticed something amiss, screams that lasted too long, smoke from the punishment shed, the mysterious disappearance of troublesome slaves, there was always a reasonable explanation. Charles was a master of plausible deniability, quick to provide logical reasons for anything that might raise eyebrows. Those screams. Natural childbirth complications, you understand. These women are prone to dramatics. The smoke. Burning old, diseased clothing to prevent the spread of illness. We take health very seriously on our plantation. Missing slaves. Sold them to my brother's plantation in Georgia. They seemed homesick for field work. When guests noticed that some slaves seemed unusually thin or bore fresh marks, Eleanor would explain that they were dealing with a minor rebellion that required firm correction to maintain order and safety for everyone, including the slaves themselves. The local doctor, who occasionally visited the plantation, was told that the slaves suffered from typical Negro ailments, stomach problems from overeating, injuries from clumsiness, scars from childhood accidents before they came to the civilizing influence of the Whitmore household. Church members, who sometimes questioned the harsh treatment, were reminded that Scripture commanded slaves to obey their masters, that earthly suffering was temporary compared to eternal salvation, that showing mercy to the childlike Negro race sometimes meant being stern for their own good. Even when federal authorities occasionally made inquiries about plantation conditions, Charles had a network of respected character witnesses ready to testify to his Christian values, his fair treatment of his property, his commitment to the moral uplift of the African race through proper discipline and religious instruction. Dr. Henry Morrison was the Whitmore family physician, a man whose medical degree from Charleston Medical College gave weight to every lie he helped perpetuate. Twice a month, he would arrive at the plantation in his black carriage, ostensibly to check on the health of the enslaved population, but actually to provide medical cover for systematic abuse. When slaves showed signs of malnutrition, he diagnosed constitutional weakness, typical of the African race. When they bore whip marks, he attributed them to self-inflicted wounds common among the mentally deficient. Morrison had helped Charles develop what they called scientific management techniques, carefully calculated punishments that would inflict maximum psychological damage while leaving minimal visible evidence. He taught the overseers how to whip in patterns that would heal quickly, how to apply salt to wounds without causing fatal infections, how to deprive people of sleep and food without killing them outright. Most crucially, Morrison provided the medical expertise that made Charles's breeding program possible, examining enslaved women like livestock, determining their reproductive potential, and advising on the most profitable timing for forced pregnancies. He kept meticulous records of births, deaths, and incidents, creating a paper trail that suggested proper medical care while actually documenting systematic torture. Morrison's presence gave the plantation an air of medical legitimacy. His testimony could silence any accusations of abuse with the authority of professional expertise. But his most valuable service was teaching the Whitmores how to inflict suffering while maintaining plausible deniability, how to break people's spirits without breaking their bodies beyond repair, how to extract maximum labor while keeping their human property alive enough to reproduce and generate profit. I want you to picture Cassie as she was before the Whitmores destroyed her life, a 16-year-old girl named Cassandra, who had been born free in a small community of escaped slaves in the South Carolina backcountry. She had a mother who taught her to read using pages torn from discarded books, a father who carved wooden toys and told stories of Africa, and a younger brother who followed her everywhere like a devoted shadow. Cassie could sing in 3 languages, could identify edible plants and medicinal herbs, could cook meals that made people close their eyes and smile with their first taste. She had been courted by a young man named Samuel, a blacksmith's apprentice, who promised to build her a house with windows facing east so she could watch the sunrise every morning. But raiders had come in the night, burned their settlement, and dragged survivors to Charleston's slave markets, where families were torn apart and sold to the highest bidder. Charles Whitmore had purchased Cassie not for her cooking skills, those came later, born from desperation and necessity, but because she was young, strong, and capable of bearing children who would expand his human inventory. By the time she entered his kitchen 7 years later, she had already lost 3 children, sold away before they could walk, and watched her husband Samuel whipped to death for the crime of trying to shield her from an overseer's assault. Her 4th child, a daughter she had named Hope in defiance of her circumstances, had lived to age 5 before succumbing to a fever that could have been cured with medicine. The Whitmores fed their horses but denied their human property. Little Mary Fletcher was only 9 years old when she witnessed something that would haunt her dreams for the rest of her life, and nearly cost her that life in the process. Mary was the daughter of Reverend Jonathan Fletcher, a traveling preacher who often stayed at the Whitmore Plantation when conducting revival meetings in the area. While her father preached salvation to the white families, Mary would wander the grounds, fascinated by the hustle and bustle of plantation life that seemed so different from their quiet parsonage back home. On that humid afternoon in August 1852, she had slipped away from her afternoon nap and was exploring near the kitchen gardens, when she heard strange sounds coming from the root cellar. Not the usual sounds of food preparation, but a rhythmic grinding, like grain being processed, but sharper, more deliberate. Curiosity overcame caution as she crept closer, peering through a crack in the wooden door to see Cassie hunched over a cloth-covered table, methodically crushing wine glasses with a heavy iron pestle, her face streaked with tears as she worked. The broken crystal caught the afternoon light like diamonds as Cassie carefully swept the resulting powder into small cloth pouches, whispering what sounded like prayers or curses. Mary couldn't tell which. For several minutes, the child watched in fascination as Cassie processed glass into powder, fine as flour, her movements precise and practiced, as if she'd done this same task 100 times before. When Cassie suddenly looked up and their eyes met through that crack, Mary saw something that made her blood freeze. Not anger or surprise, but a terrible sadness mixed with a determination that seemed older than time itself. That night at dinner, Mary couldn't understand why she felt sick watching the Whitmore family praise Cassie's cornbread, why she pushed her own plate away untouched, why. But as she kept staring at the cook's steady hands as they served each course with what everyone else saw as devoted service. Mary Fletcher never spoke about what she had seen in that root cellar, but the knowledge ate away at her like acid, turning a cheerful child into a nervous, withdrawn girl who jumped at shadows and refused to eat meals prepared by anyone she didn't know personally. Her father noticed the change immediately, how she would stare at her food suspiciously, how she would wake up screaming from nightmares she couldn't or wouldn't describe, how she begged him never to take her back to the Whitmore plantation. When Reverend Fletcher pressed her for explanations, Mary would only say that something bad was happening in the kitchen. But her attempts to describe what she'd witnessed sounded like the ramblings of a child with an overactive imagination. Adults dismissed her concerns as the result of too much excitement and too little supervision, attributing her behavior to the natural nervousness of a sensitive child exposed to the unfamiliar sights and sounds of plantation life. Even when she tried to tell her mother about the lady crushing glass like flour, the words sounded so unlikely, so impossible, that her parents assumed she had misunderstood something innocent, perhaps watching Cassie grind corn or spices for cooking. The more Mary insisted something was wrong, the more her parents worried about her mental state, eventually taking her to a physician who diagnosed nervous exhaustion and prescribed rest, quiet activities, and no more discussion of disturbing fantasies. By the time the Fletcher family heard about the Christmas Eve deaths at the Whitmore plantation 6 months later, Mary had been forbidden to speak about her kitchen lady so often that she had learned to keep her terrible knowledge locked away in the deepest corners of her mind. The adults had convinced themselves that a 9-year-old child couldn't possibly have witnessed evidence of a methodical murder plot, but Mary Fletcher carried the weight of that truth until her dying day, understanding too late that sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that most desperately need to be believed. When the Whitmore family began showing symptoms of what local physicians initially diagnosed as acute gastric distress, the official response was swift, thorough, and completely designed to avoid uncovering the truth. Sheriff Thomas Whitmore, Charles's first cousin, personally oversaw the investigation, bringing in Dr. Morrison to examine the victims and conduct what appeared to be a rigorous medical inquiry. The symptoms were consistent with several known ailments: sudden onset stomach pains, vomiting blood, weakness, and eventual death from what Morrison termed hemorrhagic gastritis of unknown origin. Since such illnesses were common enough in the humid South Carolina climate, where bad water and spoiled food could kill entire families, the initial assumption was natural causes, possibly contaminated well water or tainted preserved meat from their last hunting expedition. Morrison's medical examination revealed inflammation of the digestive tract, internal bleeding, and tissue damage consistent with severe food poisoning, all documented in official reports that would later be filed with the state medical board as evidence of thorough professional investigation. The sheriff interviewed every slave on the plantation, but their testimonies were considered inherently unreliable. After all, enslaved people might fabricate stories to cause trouble for their masters or to deflect suspicion from their own potential wrongdoing. Cassie herself was questioned extensively, but her obvious grief at losing the family she had served so faithfully, combined with her detailed knowledge of every meal she had prepared during the weeks leading up to the illness, convinced investigators that she was not only innocent, but potentially another victim of whatever natural disaster had befallen the household. The investigation concluded that the Whitmore family had died from a tragic combination of bad luck and natural causes, possibly exacerbated by the stress of managing a large plantation during difficult economic times. Let's be real. The Whitmore family's final months weren't just about sudden illness and mysterious death. Those who survived long enough to be observed by neighbors and visitors had become walking testimonies to systematic internal destruction, their bodies transformed into evidence of Cassie's methodical artistry. Eleanor Whitmore, once known for her robust health and commanding presence at social gatherings, had become a gaunt specter who could barely manage whispered conversations, her face drawn and pale, her hands constantly pressed against her stomach as if trying to hold her insides together. The children showed the most heartbreaking changes. Little Sarah, who had been plump and rosy-cheeked, began refusing solid food entirely, surviving on watered-down broths that still caused her to double over in pain, her cries echoing through the house at all hours. Thomas, the active 10-year-old who had once climbed trees and raced horses, spent his final weeks curled in bed, too weak to walk, his skin taking on a yellowish tinge that servants whispered looked like death approaching. Even Charles himself, the robust master who had once boasted of his iron constitution and hearty appetite, had been reduced to a shadow of his former self, constantly spitting up blood into handkerchiefs that Eleanor tried to hide from visitors but couldn't conceal from household staff who did the washing. The family's behavior had also changed dramatically. They had become suspicious of each other, wondering if someone was trying to poison them, never imagining that their beloved cook was systematically destroying them from within, with every meal she served with such apparent devotion. Neighbors who visited during those final months would later describe the household as feeling cursed, with an atmosphere of impending doom that seemed to seep from the very walls. This is where the story gets truly chilling, because Cassie's method wasn't born from rage or impulse, but from 7 years of careful observation, experimentation, and refinement that would make modern forensic scientists respect her precision. She had started with larger glass fragments, testing on rats she caught in the plantation's grain stores, studying how different sizes of crushed crystal affected their digestive systems, timing their death throes to understand the optimal dosage for extended suffering rather than quick death. Through trial and error, she discovered that wine glasses produced the finest, sharpest powder when crushed with specific techniques, wrapped in cloth to muffle sound, ground with a stone pestle in circular motions that created uniform particle sizes, sifted through increasingly fine mesh until the resulting powder looked identical to wheat flour or cornstarch. She learned that mixing the glass powder with certain foods masked any remaining crystalline texture. Cornbread absorbed it completely. Gravies disguised any grittiness, and sweet desserts actually made the tiny shards more palatable as they coated the mouth with sugar. The genius lay in her dosage control. Too much glass would cause immediate, violent symptoms that would raise suspicion. Too little would be expelled by the body without causing permanent damage. Cassie calculated the perfect amount to cause progressive internal bleeding, tissue damage that would accumulate over months, creating symptoms that mimicked natural illness while slowly, inexorably destroying their digestive systems from within. She kept mental records of each family member's tolerance levels, adjusting portions based on their size, age, and apparent symptoms, ensuring that their decline appeared natural, even inevitable. Most brilliantly, she had used their own prejudices against them. When they praised her, cooking demanded seconds, insisted she prepare their favorite dishes, they were literally asking for larger doses of their own destruction. Now you have to understand, heroes in real life rarely look like the ones in books. They're usually broken, flawed, driven by personal demons rather than noble ideals. Samuel Harrison was one such hero, and he probably wouldn't have cared about the Whitmore plantation at all if it weren't for the guilt that had been eating him alive for 12 years. Samuel had been the slave trader who sold Cassie's family into bondage, a free black man from Charleston who had survived by becoming a collaborator in the very system that oppressed his people, trading human souls for his own safety and a few coins that never felt like enough. He told himself he was helping families by ensuring they went to better masters, by negotiating for children to stay with mothers when possible, by providing information about which plantations offered the least brutal conditions. But late at night, when the whiskey couldn't numb the memories, Samuel saw their faces. Every man, woman, and child whose freedom he had sold, every family he had helped destroy, every life he had traded for his own survival. When word reached Charleston about the mysterious deaths at the Whitmore plantation, something about the story nagged at him, a feeling he couldn't shake that this wasn't just another case of natural death among the white plantation elite. Perhaps it was the timing. Christmas Eve, a night when enslaved people often attempted escape or revenge. Perhaps it was the description of the symptoms, too convenient, too complete, too perfectly tragic. Or perhaps it was simply that Samuel Harrison knew better than anyone what desperation could drive people to do. What kind of patient, methodical hatred could grow in the heart of someone who had lost everything and been forced to smile while serving those who had destroyed their life. Samuel's investigation began not with official inquiries or legal procedures, but with the underground network of communication that connected enslaved communities throughout South Carolina, a system of shared information, whispered warnings, and coded messages that allowed survival strategies to spread faster than any newspaper. Using his contacts from years in the slave trade, Samuel began visiting plantations near the Whitmore property, ostensibly checking on people he had previously sold, but actually gathering intelligence about the deaths that were being discussed in hushed tones throughout the quarters. What he discovered painted a picture far different from the official story of natural illness and family tragedy. Slaves from neighboring plantations had noticed strange behaviors in the months leading up to the deaths. Cassie requesting glass bottles and containers from other kitchens, claiming she needed them for preserving foods, and her unusual interest in learning about natural remedies from older women who had knowledge of plants and roots that could heal or harm. One elderly woman remembered Cassie asking detailed questions about grinding techniques for medicinal herbs, wanting to know how to achieve the finest possible powder, how to ensure even distribution in food, how to mask bitter or unusual tastes with familiar flavors. Samuel also discovered that Cassie had been seen near the family cemetery at odd hours, not visiting graves but collecting something from the ground. Eventually, he realized she had been gathering small stones with specific properties for grinding glass. Most telling was the testimony of a young slave from a nearby plantation who had been secretly learning to read and had helped Cassie decipher portions of a medical text stolen from Dr. Morrison's carriage. Passages about digestive ailments, internal bleeding, and the effects of foreign substances on human tissue. Can you handle what comes next? Because this is where the story turns truly chilling, where we move beyond simple revenge into something that challenges our understanding of justice, survival, and the lengths human beings will go to reclaim their dignity. What you're about to hear isn't just the conclusion of a murder plot. It's the moment when one woman's desperate act of vengeance became a symbol of resistance that would inspire and terrify in equal measure. I want you to understand that what happened next changed not just the lives of everyone involved, but the entire landscape of how enslaved people viewed their options, their power, and their ability to fight back against systems designed to destroy their humanity. If you're still with me, if you have the stomach for the truth about what oppressed people will do when pushed beyond all human endurance, then keep watching. But know this, once you hear Cassie's full story, you'll never be able to look at American history the same way again. The comfortable narratives about patient suffering and eventual freedom, about good masters and grateful slaves, about the gradual progress of moral enlightenment, all of those stories crumble when confronted with the reality of what actually happened in those plantation kitchens, those dining rooms, those moments when the powerless found ways to reclaim power that the powerful never saw coming. Subscribe to Echoes of Truth. If you're ready to confront the stories they didn't teach you in school, and comment below if you think you can handle the weight of knowing what people like Cassie were really thinking as they smiled and served and planned their methodical, patient, absolutely justified revenge. Samuel Harrison's investigation might have remained just another collection of whispered suspicions, if not for a stroke of luck that revealed the undeniable proof he needed to confirm Cassie's guilt and, paradoxically, her brilliance. 3 weeks after the Whitmore deaths, while the estate was being inventoried for probate, Samuel convinced the court-appointed administrator to let him examine the slave quarters for valuable items that might be sold to settle debts, a reasonable request from someone known to have connections in Charleston's markets for both human and material property. What Samuel was really searching for were the tools and evidence of Cassie's operation, and he found them hidden with the kind of careful precision that only someone who had lived under constant surveillance would employ. Beneath the floorboards of her cabin, wrapped in oiled cloth and secured in a wooden box that had once held tea imported from Charleston, Samuel discovered the complete apparatus of methodical murder: 4 different grinding stones of varying coarseness, cloth filters in multiple grades of fineness, small measuring spoons carved from bone, and most damning of all, detailed records kept in a code that combined African symbols she remembered from childhood with scratches and marks that represented the Whitmore family members and their meal schedules. The box also contained samples of her work, tiny pouches of glass powder in different grades of fineness, each labeled with marks that corresponded to specific family members and specific types of food, demonstrating a level of scientific method that would have impressed university researchers. But the most chilling discovery was a journal entry written in careful English letters, apparently copied from words she had heard or seen elsewhere. Every grain of sand makes the desert. Every drop of blood makes the ocean. Every day, oz of patience makes the justice. Samuel understood immediately that he wasn't just looking at evidence of murder, but at the documentation of a revolution. One woman's systematic destruction of an entire family using nothing but determination, intelligence, and the very system of domestic service that was supposed to keep her powerless. Samuel Harrison had perhaps 30 seconds to make a decision that would determine whether Cassie's story remained buried with her victims or became the evidence that would change how the world understood enslaved people's capacity for methodical resistance. As he knelt in Cassie's cabin, studying the tools and records of her 7-year murder campaign, he heard voices approaching, the estate administrator returning with Sheriff Thomas Whitmore for a more thorough search of the slave quarters. Samuel's first instinct was self-preservation. He could replace everything exactly as he had found it, slip away unnoticed, and let Cassie's secret die with her when she was inevitably sold to another plantation. But as he looked at those carefully carved measuring spoons, those meticulously organized pouches of glass powder, those coded records that represented the most sophisticated resistance operation he had ever encountered, Samuel realized he was holding proof that enslaved people weren't just victims. They were strategic thinkers, patient planners, capable of intellectual and operational sophistication that white society refused to acknowledge. The voices were getting closer, and Samuel could hear the sheriff's distinctive laugh as he joked about cleaning up this mess and getting full value from the remaining property. Moving with the speed born from years of dangerous transactions in the slave trade, Samuel grabbed the most incriminating evidence: the journal entries, several pouches of glass powder, and one of the grinding stones, and slipped them into a canvas bag he carried for collecting items of value. He managed to restore the hiding place to its original appearance and slip out the back of the cabin just as the administrator's voice echoed from the front door. But as he hurried toward the tree line where his horse waited, Samuel caught sight of movement in the main house. Someone was watching from an upstairs window, someone who had seen him leave the slave quarters with more than he had carried in. The official raid on the abandoned Whitmore plantation came at dawn 3 days later, led by Sheriff Thomas Whitmore and a carefully selected team of investigators whose primary mission was not to uncover the truth, but to control it. What they found in Cassie's cabin exceeded even Samuel Harrison's discoveries, revealing the full scope of an operation that had been far more extensive and sophisticated than anyone had imagined. Hidden throughout the small space were additional caches of evidence that painted a picture of methodical planning that spanned not just the 7 years of the murders, but more than a decade of preparation and experimentation. Beyond the grinding tools and glass powder, investigators discovered detailed anatomical drawings copied from medical texts, showing the human digestive system with careful notations about vulnerability points and optimal damage locations. Cassie had somehow gained access to veterinary and medical knowledge, possibly through her forced interactions with Dr. Morrison during his plantation visits, and had applied that knowledge with the precision of a trained researcher. The most disturbing discovery was a collection of test materials, small animal bones and preserved tissue samples that showed Cassie had been experimenting with different types of glass, different grinding techniques, and different delivery methods for years before beginning her campaign against the Whitmore family. She had created what amounted to a laboratory for murder, complete with detailed records of experimental results, failure analyses, and incremental improvements to her methodology. But the evidence that most terrified the investigators was a series of letters written in careful English, addressed to enslaved people on other plantations, sharing her techniques and encouraging them to serve justice with every meal. The raid revealed that Cassie hadn't just murdered the Whitmore family. She had been attempting to create a network of resistance that would transform every plantation kitchen in the South into a potential site of methodical, patient, invisible warfare. The investigation into the Whitmore deaths revealed layers of corruption and complicity that extended far beyond one plantation, exposing a network of respected Charleston citizens whose reputations had been built on systematic brutality disguised as Christian charity. Dr. Henry Morrison, the family physician whose medical expertise had provided cover for years of abuse, was discovered to have been conducting unauthorized medical experiments on enslaved people throughout his career, using plantation infirmaries as testing grounds for surgical techniques and drug treatments that would later be applied to white patients. His detailed records, seized during the investigation, documented procedures performed without anesthesia, experimental surgeries that often resulted in death or permanent disability, and breeding programs designed to produce enslaved people with specific physical characteristics for specialized labor or sexual exploitation. Sheriff Thomas Whitmore, Charles's cousin, was revealed to have been operating an illegal slave trading network that kidnapped free black people from neighboring states and sold them into bondage in South Carolina, using his law enforcement position to provide legitimacy for forged ownership documents and fraudulent bills of sale. The investigation also uncovered evidence that Eleanor Whitmore had been running a sophisticated money laundering operation, using her charity work and social connections to hide profits from illegal slave trading and to invest stolen wealth in Charleston real estate and banking ventures. Most shocking was the discovery that Charles Whitmore himself had been involved in a multi-state conspiracy to breed enslaved people specifically for medical experimentation, working with researchers at several Southern universities to provide test subjects for studies that would never have been legal if conducted on white populations. The Whitmore plantation had been not just a site of agricultural production, but a hub of criminal activity that had infected Charleston's entire social and economic elite with corruption disguised as respectability. The Whitmore investigation ultimately revealed connections that stretched from Charleston's drawing rooms to London's financial districts, exposing an international network of human trafficking and exploitation that made individual plantation crimes seem small by comparison. Through coded correspondence found in Charles Whitmore's private papers, investigators discovered that the plantation had been serving as a testing ground for methods of psychological control and physical manipulation that were being developed for use throughout the British Empire's colonial territories. Charleston's medical colleges had been sharing research with institutions in Jamaica, Barbados, and British Guyana, creating a cross-Atlantic exchange of information about breaking human resistance, maximizing labor extraction, and breeding populations for specific characteristics that would enhance profitability. The glass powder murders had inadvertently exposed shipping records showing that enslaved people from the Whitmore plantation had been regularly transported to medical facilities in Cuba and Brazil, where they were subjected to experimental procedures before being either returned as trained medical assistants or disappearing entirely from official records. Financial documents revealed that European investors had been funding American plantation operations specifically to generate test subjects for tropical disease research, using enslaved populations as deliberate infection vectors to study yellow fever, malaria, and cholera transmission patterns that would inform colonial expansion strategies. Most horrifically, the investigation uncovered evidence of a planned expansion of these operations, with investors preparing to establish similar facilities in Africa itself, using American-trained personnel and proven techniques to create industrial-scale human experimentation programs disguised as agricultural development projects. Cassie's methodical murders had accidentally triggered the exposure of a conspiracy that spanned continents and involved some of the most respected names in international commerce, medical research, and colonial administration, revealing that slavery in America was not just a domestic institution, but part of a global system of scientific racism and experimental brutality. The most chilling aspect of the Whitmore case wasn't the murders themselves, but the coordinated effort by Charleston's entire power structure to ensure that the truth would never reach the public, revealing how deeply complicit respectable society was in maintaining systems of oppression through organized silence. Within weeks of the investigation's most damning discoveries, a carefully orchestrated campaign began to rewrite the official narrative, involving newspaper editors, church leaders, legal officials, and business leaders in a conspiracy to protect not just individual reputations, but the entire ideological foundation of Southern society. Newspaper accounts of the deaths were quietly revised to remove any mention of glass powder, replacing detailed descriptions of Cassie's sophisticated murder methods with vague references to unknown illness and tragic natural causes. Church records were altered to show that the Whitmore family had died as martyrs of Christian service, with sermons preached about their dedication to civilizing their enslaved people and their tragic fate as examples of God's mysterious will. Legal documents were sealed or destroyed, court testimonies were suppressed, and witnesses were either bought off or intimidated into silence, creating an official record that bore no resemblance to the actual facts of the case. Medical journals that had initially published articles about the unusual symptoms and mysterious deaths suddenly retracted their findings, with editors claiming insufficient evidence and speculative conclusions, despite having access to extensive physical evidence and multiple expert testimonies. Most insidiously, the conspiracy extended to the educational system, with textbook publishers, historians, and teachers collaborating to ensure that future generations would never learn about enslaved people's capacity for sophisticated resistance, maintaining the fiction that slavery was a benevolent institution accepted passively by grateful recipients of Christian civilization. The silence wasn't accidental or organic. It was a deliberate, coordinated campaign to preserve white supremacy by denying the intellectual equality that Cassie's crimes had so clearly demonstrated. The aftermath of the Whitmore murders scattered the key players across a landscape of justice delayed, denied, and perverted, with outcomes that reflected the racial and class hierarchies that had enabled the original crimes. Cassie herself disappeared from the historical record immediately after the investigation, sold quickly to a plantation in Louisiana, where she would be far from anyone who knew her story, her fate unknown, but almost certainly grim, as troublesome slaves were often worked to death in the sugar fields where life expectancy was measured in months rather than years. Samuel Harrison faced the most immediate consequences for his role in exposing the truth, finding himself charged with theft, trespassing, and inciting unrest among the slave population, charges that carried potential sentences ranging from heavy fines to imprisonment or even exile from South Carolina. His connections in Charleston's commercial community, built over years of profitable slave trading, abandoned him completely once his investigation threatened the social order they all depended upon, leaving him to face trial alone and nearly penniless. Dr. Morrison managed to escape serious consequences despite overwhelming evidence of his criminal medical experiments, using his connections within Charleston's medical establishment and his family's political influence to have charges reduced to professional misconduct, resulting in a temporary suspension of his license and a fine that represented less than a month's income from his practice. Sheriff Thomas Whitmore retained his position despite clear evidence of corruption, protected by political connections and the convenient fact that his victims had been black people whose legal status made crimes against them difficult to prosecute under South Carolina law. The surviving Whitmore children were quietly adopted by relatives who moved them to Virginia, where they grew up wealthy and respected, never knowing the full truth about their parents' crimes or their cook's methodical revenge, their inheritance built on blood money that continued to generate profit for decades after their parents' deaths. The story of Cassie and the glass powder murders spread like smoke through the enslaved quarters of the South, whispered in the dark, retold beside fires, and woven into songs and folktales that carried more than one meaning. It was not just a lurid tale of revenge, it became a legend that embodied resistance, patience, intelligence, and the terrible arithmetic of oppression, where cruelty repeated without end inevitably produces retaliation of equal precision. In the symbolic, coded language of plantation folklore, Cassie came to stand for the hidden intellectual strength of the enslaved, the quiet brilliance that allowed people to watch, calculate, and design strategies of survival or subversion while outwardly playing the part of obedient laborers. Her story did not spread to inspire imitators, but as undeniable proof that enslaved people possessed the same capacity for reasoning, planning, and moral reflection that white society arrogantly claimed as its sole inheritance. The lesson embedded in Cassie's tale was not a shallow fantasy of vengeance. It was a meditation on justice delayed for too long, on how countless small acts of defiance can gather into something devastating, on the way systemic dehumanization eventually lays the groundwork for its own collapse. For those few within white society who uncovered the truth, the story carried a grim warning that enslaved people could not forever be forced into contradiction, expected to be clever enough to manage complex labor, yet ignorant enough to accept lifelong bondage. Cassie's careful murders struck at more than her victims. They struck at the very assumptions on which slavery justified itself. Her legend endures as a reminder that every oppressive system plants the seeds of its destruction, and that those who live from cruelty should never assume safety, even in their dining rooms, even when smiles mask rage. Could something like this truly happen in our own time? Would we recognize the signs before it unfolded, or would it slip silently into the fabric of daily life while we remained blind? As you sit in your comfortable home, surrounded by the conveniences of modern living, eating meals prepared and packaged by people whose faces you have never seen, whose names you do not know, and whose struggles you have likely never paused to consider, ask yourself honestly, what would you do if all of it, the comfort, the security, the freedom, were stripped away in a single instant? Imagine being forced to serve those who had destroyed your family, your community, your future. Imagine discovering that the only small power you held in your hands came not from rebellion in the open, but from the very service that announced your powerlessness to the world. Cassie's story is not only a tale about slavery or the antebellum South. It is a meditation on human transformation when the limits of endurance are exceeded, on the terrible ingenuity that springs from despair, and on the quiet brilliance that hides beneath masks of compliance, patience, or servitude. The infamous glass powder murders represent more than historical curiosity. They embody the eternal truths of domination, resistance, and human survival. They remind us that in every age, in every society, there exist those with unchecked power over the lives, dreams, and dignity of others. Subscribe to Echoes of Truth if you are ready for stories that unsettle and challenge. Share your thoughts below. Was Cassie a hero, a villain, or something far more complex?